The Brutalist is finally out in theaters near me. I got to see it last night in an IMAX screening, and does it live up to the hype around the potential like Best Picture win or Best Director win, and just all the plaudits that it's received? Yeah, I think it does live up to it. This movie was directed by Brady Corbet, stars Adrian Brody, Guy Pearce, Joe Alwyn, and Felicity Jones. It is a seemingly at first, I would say, you're kind of your classic American epic story of an immigrant who is forced to relocate to America during World War II. He ends up in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia area. A lot of Pennsylvania talk, which we love to see, of course. The first act of this 3.5-hour movie that includes a 15-minute intermission is pretty perfect, I think. It opens very in your face with the upside down Statue of Liberty shots that you probably have seen in the trailers and things like that. It's really, really good stuff. The look of this movie, this was shot on VistaVision, which I didn't even know was a technology really, because it's not used anymore as a technology from, I think, like the 50s that is just simply not around anymore. Shot on that, looks amazing. The score and the sound of this movie is really, really good. Seeing it in an IMAX theater certainly helps for sure, but the score is pretty top notch. It's so much like big brass instruments in your face. It feels like the score is just being played right in front of your eyes and ears while the movie is going on. It is basically perfect. I think the costuming and the atmosphere is really good. It really sets you in this time period and really does a good job of setting the mood from scene to scene, because this movie is definitely up and down in terms of how it wants you to feel. Adrian Brody in this is fantastic throughout basically the whole movie. Guy Pearce is kind of not as much in the first act as I thought he would be. And Joe Alwyn is in kind of 50-50 in both, and Felicity Jones is just not in the first act straight up, which was a surprise to me. I did not know that she would not be in the first act. And again, I say first act, the 3.5-hour movie, there's a 15-minute intermission, basically right at the halfway point, give or take. I think it's maybe the movie split like 40-60%, I think. The first act is very, I don't want to say down the middle, because there are things going on that like surprised me or I didn't really see coming. Like Guy Pearce being kind of almost the comedic relief at times, despite the fact that his character is inherently the bad guy, an evil person. But it's played so well because he clearly doesn't know that he's evil, and that he's just hiding so much kind of, self-reflection issues, and is just trying to always be the smartest guy in the room, despite the fact that he's absolutely the stupidest at all times. The second act, I think I only liked the second act. I didn't love it. If I loved the first act, like basically 10 out of 10, the second act is probably only like a 6 or a 7 for me, which is a real bummer. It has some weird turns. It totally flips the first act on its head, in my opinion. It's a total obliteration of the slightly more hopeful and kind of by the numbers first act. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It subverts the expectations pretty well. It's definitely accomplishing what I think it wants to do. I just don't know if I agree with it. If the first act is like your classic, the American story, immigrant comes from nothing, rags to riches story, and not necessarily the richest part, but the rags to getting the opportunity in America to do what he wants to do and what he loves. The second act kind of destroys that and says, it's more complicated than that. It's not black and white. Actually, the American dream doesn't really even exist in a way. The subtext of the movie, the subtext of the first act, I think becomes the text. And that is really emboldened by Guy Pearce's performance in the second act, where he is overtly more evil. I guess the quick plot summary is Adrian Brody is the immigrant architect. Guy Pearce is playing this rich guy. His name is his name is comic. His name might as well be like Old Timey Villain the Third. His last name is Van Buren. I can't remember his first name off the top of my head, but Joe Alwyn plays his son. They're both very good in the movie, very funny at times, always menacing, but in like a dopey kind of way. Menacing because they only have power because they have money. But it seems pretty clear that they're not smart enough to like earn the money that they've gotten. And so in the first act, he enlists Brody to essentially build this big. He commissions him to build a big community center of some sort. And he's impressed with Adrian Brody's brutalism style of architecture, which is hence the Brutalist. And in the second act, Pierce's character becomes much more evil, not in the subtext, but the text. The movie takes some very odd turns, even with Adrian Brody's character, where he becomes more complicated, but not in a way that I loved the whole time. Felicity Jones shows up in the second act as his wife, and no offense to Felicity Jones, I think she's a very good actor, but I don't think she's very good in this movie. I don't think she looks good in this movie in the sense that the wig that she's wearing, I think, is actually atrocious. It's very distracting, and it's just clear that she's doing an accent, and it's very distracting in my opinion. Like Adrian Brody and Guy Pearce to an extent, Brody more in particular, is able to do great accent work. Even on like Peaky Blinders, where he's like, his name may as well be like Fettuccine Alfredo. He's doing such a stereotypical, funny Italian accent in Peaky Blinders. He pulls it off, and he pulls off this kind of Eastern European. He's from Budapest. This Eastern European accent as well. But I don't think Felicity Jones pulls it off. And a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the kind of hinge points of the second act rely on her, and I don't think it necessarily works. The last scene that she's in is very harrowing, I would say, where essentially she confronts Guy Pearce and many of his collaborators on basically the evils that he has done. One evil act in particular that I will not spoil, but and it's very good. That scene really works. I think the camera work in that scene is fantastic because there's a lot of kind of like shaky movements in it, and that's kind of how the whole second act goes. The camera work in the first act is very steady, I think, and more reliable on purpose. And then again, just much like the kind of how the script turns the first act on its head, the camera becomes much more shaky and kind of all over the place in the second act. There is a weird like trip to Italy to look at marble for an altar that goes into the community church that Adrian Brody is commissioning, and I just don't really think I liked the Italy part. I understand what was happening in it for the most part, but I just don't think it was for me necessarily. And I don't know if I don't think that's on me. Like, I get what the movie was going for. It was going for this very weird, and again, it's flipping the first act on its head. That's all I could think about really during the second act, was just how everything is contradicting the first act, basically. And if the first act is building up these kind of, not stereotypes, but these classic tales of American immigration and the American dream and such, and just I felt like every single scene in the second act, it tears it down, which is fine with me. I am totally okay with stories about the deconstruction of the American dream and deconstruction of these societies and cultures that we have built up over the decades. But at times, I just don't necessarily think it worked. And while the last scene with Felicity Jones is good, there is a prologue at the end of the movie that just feels, I don't know, almost kind of too on the nose, where it's trying to wrap everything up, and it's very obviously the kind of the classic stereotypes of like what we leave our what is our legacy, what are the things we leave behind, and that's spoken about by Brody and Pierce in a scene in a diner where they talk about the things that they leave behind, and how Brody's buildings in Europe survived World War II, basically, and how proud he is of that. And that's what he wants his legacy to be, more or less. And it ends up, there's a prologue where things get wrapped up where, in a way, he has accomplished his goal, but in other ways, not necessarily, and didn't even matter. I don't mind that stuff at all, but I don't think it tries to tie a pretty neat bow around it, I think, and I just didn't think it totally landed it. but I can't argue with the technical details of this movie, with the score, with the acting outside of Felicity Jones. Guy Pearce, in my screening, Guy Pearce got like 3 or 4 big laughs from the audience, which is crazy. He's really good in this movie. This is definitely, it's one of my 12 to 15 favorite movies of the year. Like, I know I'm talking down on the second act a lot, but that's just because the first act built up so much for me. And while I thought I liked the second act, there were just some moments in it where I think it really knocks it down a peg for me. This is still like an 8 out of 10 for me, a 4 out of 5, whatever you want to call it. I just can't argue with a lot of what's going on in it. In terms of the technicality of it, I think the performances are mostly there. The directing is really there. Again, the first 2.5-ish hours, I'm like totally on board with it. It's really the back half of the movie where I kind of start to fall off. And of course, with all great movies that with, you know, these auteur directors, and not saying Brady Corbert is an auteur, but he is certainly directing what he wants to direct, and he got final cut of this movie famously. He's talked about it in interviews. This movie is also about making a movie and dealing with rich, evil producers that don't actually care about your movie. They just care about the bottom dollar, and they care about, you know, cutting costs and yada yada yada. Don't care about artistry. And Adrien Brody is quite the opposite. He's a troubled artist that is struggling around the world, the world that surrounds him, in terms of, you know, who gives him the right to do these things and make these artistic choices, and so on and so forth. It's a little bit Inception-esque, I guess, where it's a movie about a movie, but how many of those are there in the world? And that's not a bad thing. You know, there are no original ideas anymore, basically. So there are worse people to copy than, you know, guys like Paul Thomas Anderson in The Master is for sure an influence by Corbet. And same with There Will Be Blood, when it just comes to, you know, kind of the ruthless capitalism kind of understatement that's in this movie. Overall, this is a very good movie. I know it's a 3.5-hour movie, so that might turn people off, but you can sit on your couch and watch like 8 episodes of the worst Netflix show in the world, and you're fine with that. And that they have 50-minute episodes each. Go sit in a movie for 3.5 hours. Go get your popcorn, get your snacks, get a slushie. Sit down and watch this movie. It's fantastic. I got a poster when I went, and it's pretty cool. It's not my favorite poster ever. I don't even have it near me, but, you know, I'll hang it in my office or something. But yeah, that is my review of The Brutalist. Go see it. I think it has a strong chance to win Best Picture. It's definitely not the favorite right now, but I think it could be over the next coming weeks as this rolls out a little bit wider. A24 has done this kind of slow release schedule with it, and it might pay off, because this thing is on a $10 million budget, and it's 3.5 hours, and it's this epic, I say, story. It's probably going to gross like 30 million, I would guess, which would be a huge win for it. So I think Brody is either first or second in the Best Actor race. It's either him or Chalamet this year for sure. Guy Pearce, I think, has an outside shot at supporting, but probably not. Felicity Jones is running in supporting actress as well. And Corbet for director and Best Picture and screenplay, and a bunch of technical awards too. So this movie is for sure going to be important. So go watch it if you haven't. If you can find the time, take a nice 3 to 4 hour chunk of your day and go watch The Brutalist. But that's my review. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.